Good. In the movie Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the main character, Brick, says this: Mendacity is a system we live in. Liquor's one way out, and death's the other. If you remember the film at all, you'll remember Brick's father, Big Daddy, the fat, loudmouthed, belligerent Southern father figure used to getting what he wanted. Brick's mother was no slight Southern belle either. She was Big Mama, a wiry Southern woman who told her daughter-in-law, when marriage is on the rocks are there, right there. I guess for her, the rocks, in a pinch, are your only comfort. And then there's Brick, the main character. The man who all gay men and women watching at the time knew instinctively was one of them. Brick rails during the whole movie against the poker face he's required to wear, the woman he's required to marry, the whole fake system that keeps a gay man locked into a situation he hates. My uncle, like Brick, like myself, married young, had beautiful children, and in his late 30s, drove himself out to a country road and shot himself in the heart. For Brick, liquor was the escape. And for my uncle, it was a .25 caliber pistol. Mendacity. According to the dictionary, mendacity is a word that means deceit, bluffing, sleight of hand, camouflage, concealment. But it comes from a Latin root, mendac, which means to put right, to make amends. How can mendacity be an attempt to make things right? Because even in mendacity, and even perhaps especially in mendacity, there is a belief that things can be better. Liars are optimists, not pessimists. And they want so fervently to believe in their values and their worldview that they will lie and deceive to prop things up. Big Daddy and Big Mama were true believers. Oral Roberts, another true believer. They fervently believed that if they pushed on past the rough things in life and lied a bit along the way, things would eventually get better. They held on by the skin of their teeth. Even so, there is a way out of mendacity, a way to make things right without lying, without camouflage, without hiding in closets or the liquor cabinet or behind a gun. Brick was wrong. Death and liquor are not the only ways out. My mother did everything she could to raise me in the world portrayed in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Even though I was born in 1974, in our house, the clock stopped in the 1950s. Most of the movies we watched at home were from the 50s, the music we listened to, the books we read. It was as if time stopped still and the present didn't exist. MTV wasn't allowed in the house. Instead, we had the early Beatles, not the late. The Beach Boys, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, I Want to Hold Your Hand. If she'd been successful in recreating the 1950s for me, I might have followed the same path my uncle did. But in fact, in my mid-20s, I did come out to myself and admit openly to myself that I was gay. But I was married to a beautiful wife with 3 beautiful children, and I was stuck in that system of mendacity, and I was waiting, literally, for death. This was in my mid-20s, but let me back up a little bit to 1987, when I realized for the first time what the family I lived in was really like. I was 12 years old in the 7th grade, attending Victory Christian School on 71st Street in South Tulsa. And my grandfather climbed up into a tower and told the world on national television that if he didn't get $8 million, the Lord would call him home. God had commanded it, and if he didn't come up with the cash, it was over. I was 12 years old, and in the world I was living in, this wasn't as unusual as you might expect. I was told there was a rhyme and reason to everything in God's world. If you had a question, the Bible always had the answer. So, when my grandfather climbed up into that tower, I randomly opened the Bible for guidance, and my fingers landed on this passage from Isaiah. Behold, I have given him for a witness to the people, a leader and commander to the people. Behold, thou shalt call a nation that thou knowest not, and nations that knew not thee shall run unto thee because of the Lord thy God. Well, I was 12 years old, and the tower business didn't make a lot of sense, but there was that passage from Isaiah, and it seemed like God was talking directly to me. At night, I had dreams that the $8 million in donations wouldn't come in, and my grandfather would be taken up to heaven in a chariot, like Ezekiel in the Bible. One time at school, I overheard two teachers talking about how Oral was a Cherokee Indian. And there was a long-standing tradition among Indian chiefs that if they wanted the tribe to do something that the tribe didn't want to do, the chief threatened death and literally fell over and died on the promised day. As far as I can tell, there is no such tradition. But even so, I imagine my grandfather, who at 70 years of age, with his long hanging ears and bulbous, impressive nose, really did look the part of an Indian chief. I imagined him sitting up there in the prayer tower one day and suddenly expiring on his prayer rug. I imagined a lot of things, all pretty far-fetched seeming now, but at the time, completely in line with the culture I lived in, culture in many ways shaped by the teachings of my grandfather. Oral began preaching the word in the late 1930s as a 19-year-old during the Great Depression. My grandmother Evelyn told me that food was often scarce, and Oral would sometimes go out and shoot swamp rabbits, I don't know what those are, which she would then dutifully clean and bring downtown where you could rent communal freezer space. Oral's ministry grew slowly, reaching its prime only in the 60s and 70s when he built Oral Roberts University and pioneered the electric church, becoming the first televangelist. His television programs eventually first came out of studios in Burbank, California, and his message was simple and contrary to what priests and preachers have been telling us for thousands of years. God, according to Oral, wasn't very interested in punishing us. In fact, all we needed to do was stretch out our hands in faith and believe, because God wanted to bring healing. Healing to our bodies, healing to our marriage, healing to our loved ones, and, yes, healing to our pocketbooks. It was a revolutionary message, and one that really hadn't been heard in quite the same way before. God is a good God, Oral intoned on national television. Something good is going to happen to you. By January of 1987, when Oral climbed into that tower, donations had been falling off for years. The fall of Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, the failure of the City of Faith, much of which still stands empty today, were all part of the reason for the decline in revenue. His efforts to bring in the money to keep his empire afloat became more and more ridiculous. But he continued using that feel-good phrase. Something good is going to happen to you. I can see the appeal in those words. Hope is the thing with feathers, Emily Dickinson once wrote, but perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. These days, selling hope is a well-worn path, and Barack Obama, for whom my grandfather voted, inspired the nation by blanketing walls and subway stations and billboards with this one powerful word. It's surprising, I'm sure, that Oral voted for Barack Obama, but giving a choice between a man selling fear and a man who simply said, yes, we can, it must have been easy for Oral Roberts, who grew up in a shotgun shack in southeastern Oklahoma. He built a 500-acre kingdom on the banks of the Arkansas River, a kingdom funded by faith and faith alone. Something good is going to happen to you. But I digress. I'm not 36 and out-of-the-closet gay writer, happily raising his kids in Dallas, Texas. I'm just 12 years old, and my grandfather just climbed up into a 200-foot tall tower, saying if he didn't get $8 million, the Lord would take him home. The whole city here of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the evangelical reaches of the entire world were holding their collective breath, awaiting the outcome. And me, I really wasn't so worried. I figured either he would get the money and come down, or he wouldn't, and God would take him to heaven. If you believed the hype, it was a win-win situation. When you're 12, you buy just about everything your family tells you, so I didn't really worry much at all about Oral. What I did worry about and continued to worry about for at least the next 15 years was the condition of my soul. While everybody else was worrying about Oral, I was worried that Jesus would come down, perched on a cloud in the sky, and whisk all the Christians up to heaven. Like the title of the popular evangelical novel blares loudly from its cover, I was worried about being left behind. The prayer tower, as Oral called it, was for me a symbol of the second coming of Christ, and this is how he planned it. It was built along with most of the other buildings at Oral Roberts University in the late 1960s as a symbol of hope. In this tower, he installed two things: a phone bank manned by faithful little old ladies who would answer your call day or night and pray with you on a toll-free number, and a gas flame installed on the top of the tower, manned at all times, day and night, by a born-again Christian whose heart was right with God. This tower became the focus of my fear of the rapture. We were living on the Oral Roberts compound off of 75th Street in South Tulsa, just off of Lewis Avenue, in a 3-acre piece of land surrounded by an 8-foot stockade fence and a chain link topped with barbed wire and electrified. When I joke I was raised in a Pentecostal compound, I'm not really joking. I would walk my dog down my 50-yard long driveway, out the first gate and the second gate, and across the 75th Street to the campus of ORU. And there was one more gate, and as soon as my dog Samson and I went through, there was the prayer tower in the distance, that gas flame shining brightly from the top. Or at least, I hoped it was. On bright sunny days, it was almost impossible to tell, and that's where the fear crept in. The whole point of having that gas flame manned by a born-again Christian whose heart was right with God was this: if Jesus were to come back, perched on a cloud, and whisk away all the born-again Christians, that gas flame operator would also be whisked away, and the flame will go out. That flame, perched on top of a 200-foot tall tower at the center of campus, was both a promise and a threat. Jesus is coming back, but he's not here yet. So if you've sinned, get your heart right with God, because he might come at any moment. Well, how do you know if your heart is right with God? So while everyone else was worried about Oral in that tower, I was worried about that gas flame operator. Looking every day to see if that flame was still there. On weekends, the campus could be awfully still and quiet, and if the sun was at just the right angle and I couldn't tell if the flame was still lit, chills would go down my spine. I was 12, my grandfather was in a tower, and I was worried about the rapture, and I was also a 7th grade gay kid in an evangelical Christian middle school, trying my best to develop crushes on girls. It wasn't the easiest year of my life. In 7th grade, I went through a series of crushes on boys, 5 of them to be exact, each one more painful than the one before. I would fall for them, spend a lot of time around them, and then, realizing they wouldn't feel for me the way I felt for them, would suddenly stop talking to them. The last of the 5, in April of 1987, called me up, mad as a hornet, asking why I wouldn't talk to him anymore. "You just go through boys like Kleenex," he said. You blow your nose on them and throw them away. Neither of us quite knew what he was talking about, but we both knew he was right. So I swallowed hard and maturely hung up. I swore off boys then and there and didn't really have close male friends for a long, long, long time. When I was 18, I met a girl the first week I arrived at the University of Oklahoma, and she reminded me of my grandmother, Evelyn. Graceful, witty, intelligent, always free to say exactly what was on her mind. I told her I liked men, but that I didn't want to be with one, which was how I felt about it at the time. 2 years later, we were married. 6 years later, we had our first daughter on Father's Day, who is now 12, and I just took her to New York for Father's Day. And 5 years after that, after having 3 kids and trying our best to build the perfect little picket fence family, we were divorced after 11 years of marriage. And I cried for a year and a half over that great, great loss. There was nothing I wanted more on earth than to give my children a stable, loving, happy home comprised of a mommy and a daddy and a dog and a garden, the whole 9 yards. But sometimes in a relationship between 2 people, a ghost from the past intervenes and starts shaking things up. And sometimes in the aftermath, there's nothing left but a wrecked marriage and a chance to start over again. There were several ghosts that wrecked our marriage, several things that happened in the Pentecostal compound I grew up in that came back to haunt me. And one of them was the ghost of a man who shot himself in 1982. That ghost would be the presence in my mind of my uncle, Ronald David Roberts, Oral's eldest son, and at one time the man Oral had hoped would inherit the kingdom. Ronnie to the family, he was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant men anyone who came across his path had ever met. He taught locally here at Booker T High School. He taught English as well as Russian and Chinese. In his mid-30s, Uncle Ronnie was divorced and committed suicide soon thereafter, 6 months after coming out to Troy Perry, founder of the first gay-friendly congregation in Los Angeles, and 4 months after he was arraigned in court on prescription drug charges, leaving his 2 children, ex-wife, and extended family to bear an unbearable burden. Growing up, I didn't know any of this about my uncle, but I always wanted to be like him. Every time my mother mentioned him, I noted 2 things. One, that she probably loved him more than she had ever loved anybody else. And 2, that the memory of his path brought more pain to her than any other memory. It's still in my family a big secret that my uncle was gay. My family tells me that I am dishonoring his memory by saying so. My mother left a voicemail last fall telling me I was disgusting for linking the family name to homosexuality, and that by being openly gay, I am being cruel. Once again, mendacity. But once again, an attempt in her own way to make things right. So my wife and I, when we were married, spent a few years in spiritual transition. Having both rejected our evangelical past, we were trying to find a way to still be Christian, but also true to our intellect. And we found ourselves attending a liberal Christian church in Oklahoma City. We were there when Carlton Pearson, Bishop Pearson here, founder of Higher Dimensions, or Higher D when I was going there, came to speak. My family and I had attended Carlton's church in middle school and high school. And in fact, my parents went to Oral Roberts University with him in the early 70s. At one time, Oral publicly referred to Carlton as his son. his black son. So you might say he felt like an uncle to me, even though I hadn't seen him in years. Carlton preached an amazing sermon that day, as he often does, one that brought me to tears. Hearing him was like hearing my grandfather all over again. Here was a man who, instead of preaching that God was sending gays, communists, Catholics to hell, said there was no hell, and no mean, angry God dying to punish us. He might as well have said, God is a good God, or something good is going to happen to you. I had finally admitted to myself a year before that I was homosexual, but being gay, Christian, and married with children does not give you many good options. During that year, I had often wished I would die, but Carlton's message gave me hope. After the sermon, my wife and I waited in line to get a chance to talk to Carlton. It had been a long time since we'd seen each other. I probably hadn't been to his church since I was 15 or 16, and here I was, a full-grown man of 28 with his own children in tow. We waited about 10 minutes, and finally there we were, my wife and I, standing about 3 feet directly in front of Carlton. And I smiled and big and moved as if to hug him. But his face darkened, and I hung back, and a chill passed through my spine. We might have only stood there for 20 seconds, but it seemed like an hour. Me looking at Carlton with this silly grin pasted on my face, and him looking back at me like he'd seen a ghost. He finally said, "Which one are you?" Barely breathing. And then he said, "You're Ron and Roberta's son, aren't you?" And I nodded, "I'm Randy." He nodded back. "I thought you were Ronnie." And we both stared at each other and then finally hugged. And it was a big bear hug, a reunion of sorts. And we were both misty-eyed as we talked that day. Sometimes a particular mantle is thrust upon you, whether you like it or not. And I confess, I feel the burden of my uncle's death each and every day. I know I can't fix it, but I almost relived his life in every way. Marrying young, having children, becoming a teacher, becoming suicidal. All because I was never told his story, because his story as a gay man has been hushed up. This system of mendacity, of bluffing, of pretending, of trying to pray the gay away, has already left one casualty in my family and almost caused another. And there are countless other families out there with the same attitudes. I hear from their children all the time. I get emails from young gay men and women, sometimes older gay men and women, saying things like this: "My family won't speak to me anymore," or "My sister tells me I'm going to hell," or "I cry every night because I hate myself for being gay." There's a young gay kid living in North Dakota who's been writing me for several months. He told me the priest at his Catholic church told the layman to stop talking to him because he was gay. This system of mendacity is still with us. It's still alive and well, but we have to remember, mendacity, even in its most extreme form, is an attempt to make things right. How can we make things right? My grandfather, with all his faults, also felt a mantle thrust upon him. He was at heart a man who wanted to spread a message of hope. And while it's likely that many of the decisions he made later in life were motivated by money, it's not my impression that's what he was thinking when he was 21, 22 years old, and standing in lines, in healing lines, for hours, touching people with tuberculosis and cerebral palsy and cancer. It's not my impression that he started out to make a quick buck. Oral started out as a preacher in tiny towns in southeastern Oklahoma, convinced that the mantle thrust upon him was to encourage the poor Pentecostals around him, that God was a good God, that God did not want them to be poor, that God did not bring on diseases, as some evangelicals have suggested, that God brought HIV to kill off gay men. Oral's mantle was one he felt thrust upon him, and his message of hope transformed the evangelical church. 6 months before Oral passed away, I took my children to Los Angeles for spring break. For them, it was a chance to go to Disney World, Universal Studios, to see movie stars. And we saw Leonardo DiCaprio, the guy from Titanic. Yeah. But for me, it was a chance to pay my last respects to a man who had overshadowed my childhood. Oral never could remember my name when I was growing up, even though I lived just down the hill from him, about 20 yards, and ran up to see my grandmother several times a week. Boy and son were the only things he ever called me, if he called me at all. But in the spring of 2009, he eagerly played at great-grandfather, showing off that he had even done his homework by greeting each of my 3 children by name. And because he was no longer the scary grandfather I remembered, but a 91-year-old man barely able to hear and completely unable to leave his chair without assistance, I gladly played along. Although we never spoke of it, Oral knew I was gay, and yet that day, it didn't seem to matter. He signed a copy of his newest book for my children and gave them each a $20 bill, and our hour-long visit passed quickly. I'm grateful for that afternoon with my grandfather because, frankly, the man I grew up with in the compound was not a kind, warm grandfather. He was a driven man, one who slept 4 hours a night and the other 20 working. Even while relaxing on the golf course, Oral would be processing his next sermon in his mind or networking with business partners who might be able to help keep his ministry alive. There was always another tower to build or another tower to climb up into. That mantle burdened his soul, and there wasn't time for children. But this day was different. Oral seemed at peace, happy to sit in his armchair and play great-grandfather. He looked at me several times during that visit and sighed, and I almost felt that he was looking right through me. I almost felt like he saw my uncle in me, that here was his chance to make amends, to accept me and love me like he was unable or unwilling to do with his own son. Before we left, he asked me to come over to his chair. The children were watching a cartoon in the spare bedroom, and the living room was quiet. And I knelt down beside him, and I held his hand. Oral had large hands, the 60-foot bronze sculpture of hands that are clasped in prayer at the entrance to the university are modeled after his. And I noticed they also looked a lot like mine. I was a little shaken up. We both knew this was likely to be our last visit, and it was. As I stood up to leave, he held my hand tightly, looked up from his chair with that twinkle in his eye, and said, "Son, something good is going to happen to you." It did. My grandfather had a lot of sayings he was famous for, and the most famous, the one that used to scroll on the marquee at sport events in the Mabee Center, was this: "Expect a miracle." My grandfather lived in a system of mendacity, a system in which if you had a son who was gay, who was depressed, who was addicted to pain medication, he just hushed it up and lied about it, hoping it would go away. But in his heart, like all of us, he wanted to make things right. And if we can't forgive Oral Roberts and men like him, how can we forgive ourselves? My parents told the press the other day they have an open door policy, yet they haven't invited me or my brother, who was also gay, home for Christmas in many, many years. And yet, once again, in this lie, there is a truth. We all want reconciliation. We all want a world where things get better. And some of us will lie if we think that's the only way it can happen. Many of you in the audience today are gay, and there is someone in your life who has rejected you. Many of you in the audience today You grew up evangelical or religious in a way that no longer makes sense to you. And there is someone in your family who is angry about your choice to attend a crazy Unitarian church like this. Maybe it's your mother, your grandmother, your brother, your nephew. Many of you have family who lie about you, who hide who you really are because it makes them uncomfortable. Miracles happen through forgiveness. In every lie, there's a yearning for the truth. And in every lie, there's a yearning for a world in which things get better. In every system of mendacity, there is an optimism that is expecting a miracle. There is a sense of hope. Hang on to that hope. Live in your truth, honestly and openly. I'm going to close today with a poem by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity asked a crumb of me. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thank you.